When purchasing a home here in the Bahamas, an attorney is always needed for the real estate transaction. Both buyer and seller must have an attorney to ensure that everything is done not only properly, but it's done lawfully. Stay tuned as I speak with Ms. Rhchetta Godet from the Hosbury Chambers as we dive deeper and talk about the role of an attorney within the real estate transaction. Stay tuned. Welcome back to episode 5 of PKR. But before we move any further, if you're watching us on YouTube, you know the drill. Click the subscribe button, the same red button there, click the subscribe button. If you're watching us on Instagram, click the follow button. If you're watching us on LinkedIn, click the connect button. And if you're watching us on Facebook, click the like button. All right? So now we're going to move straight into speaking with Ms. Godet. Hello, welcome to PKR.
Thank you.
You're actually the first interviewee we have on the show, eh? So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So before we get started, just want to know, how did you get started within the real estate law part of the industry? Did you start off in corporate law, criminal law? What did you always wanted to be in real estate law? How did it start?
Well, interestingly enough, I will say that I never have or never will practice criminal law. But I was fortunate enough to work at a firm where they allowed me to kind of dip into different areas of law.
Okay.
And it kind of helped me to determine, which area I was really interested in and which area I want to kind of continue and kind of specialize in terms of my profession.
Awesome.
And so real estate was one of those areas, that I found, there was always something. Well, law generally is, it's a growing,
Correct.
always something to learn and things like that. And so, but real estate, I was very interested. And so, I just kind of took it from there and said, okay, I just continued.
Okay. And how many years have you been inside that industry dealing with real estate law?
This year would make me 8 years.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So my first question is, what exactly does an attorney do within the real estate transaction? Where exactly, what happens in that?
Well, the first thing I would ask the client actually, the first thing that I would ask them, is the property being sold by a realtor?
Okay.
And if they say yes, I would say, okay, the realtor knows his role in terms of, getting the commitment letter signed, after they've made the bid that they won. They would send me that information from the realtor, or the realtor would send it to me, and that piece of paper would have all of the information that I need to get started. Who's the seller's attorney, how much is being sold for, what is the deposit amount. The next question I would ask them is, is this within their budget?
Awesome.
In terms of
Yeah.
if you're getting a mortgage,
Correct.
have you consulted the bank to determine, what you qualify for? And once we've kind of done all of that groundwork,
Correct.
then we kind of move on from there.
So it all goes back into getting pre-qualified before you do all this.
Yes, it would probably make more sense to
Yes.
go and get pre-qualified before you start looking for somewhere. Because once, let's say, example, you pre-qualified for $200,000, then you would kind of look for something within that range.
Correct.
As opposed to going to look for something. You may be one of those people with that kind of faith where, I don't care how much I'm pre-qualified for.
Yeah.
I'm just going to go and find what I like. But it would just make more sense, more practical sense for you to go and see what you're pre-qualified for. And then you go looking for something that kind of fits into your budget. Because just because you're pre-qualified for $200,000, that doesn't mean that, you're going to use all of that. Because, we may want to save some of that room for the building portion of it or something like that. So, yeah.
Awesome. So it all goes back to when, I think it's episode 2, where I spoke about getting pre-qualified.
Yeah.
The 5 things you must do. So always get pre-qualified before you go on the hunt. It makes things so much easier for the attorneys, for everybody, because everybody knows what's next.
Yeah.
You don't have to be guessing. You sure you're pre-qualified? So make sure you get pre-qualified.
Yeah.
All right. Let's talk about the fees now.
Yeah.
Is there a standard rate, an industry rate when hiring an attorney when it comes to real estate transactions, or everybody have a different rate, or how does that work?
Everybody's rate is technically different, but the basic rate is you start anywhere between 1% to the maximum 2.5.
Okay.
But I think persons have to realize that if I say to you your legal fees are going to be around 2%, that means that 1% of that is going toward the price of the actual property, which is going to be on the conveyance.
Okay.
And then 1% is going to be for the mortgage.
Okay.
Yeah, and then that would make up the total 2% of the total transaction for legal fees.
Okay.
Now, keep in mind, sorry, that
Go
that
ahead.
has nothing to do with what the amount that the bank is asking from you. The bank may say to you, you know, we need a quote from your attorney to determine what the legal fees are, because whatever those legal fees are, the bank may require that you pay those legal fees to them, and then they will send the legal fees to the attorney once the documents have been stamped and recorded.
Okay.
So, but like I said, that has nothing really to do. My legal fees have nothing to do with what the bank itself is requiring from you in terms of payments and commitment fees and things like that.
Okay, and I heard you use the word conveyance. For those who probably just new home person who's going to buy, what do you mean by conveyance exactly?
Well, the conveyance is technically the document for the transfer of the title.
Okay.
So if you own a property, the conveyance would be the document that transfers the title of the property or the ownership of the property from you to me.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And can a buyer and a seller use the same attorney, or?
You can, but it's not the best thing to do. It's not my practice. I would recommend you can use the same law firm.
Okay. Okay.
You can use the same law firm. Using the same attorney for both the buyer and the seller is not good practice.
Okay.
Because there's confidentiality there.
Correct, yeah.
You're dealing with information from the buyer and you're dealing with information from the seller. For where I work at Hallsbury, we usually try to keep that separate and apart just for file completion. And so even though we would carry out a transaction in-house, we would have one attorney representing the buyer and one attorney representing the seller. And what you would notice is each file is totally completed. And so just because we're doing it in-house doesn't mean that we treat it any differently. We treat it as same as you were doing it or you were dealing with a vendor's attorney outside of the firm. I would never go to the other attorney's office and discuss something with them face to face. I would always send it through email.
Okay.
I still do my same requisitions, and my requisitions are answered in full. They still provide me with all the information that I need. So it's carried out, the same way you would as the other attorney representing someone outside of the firm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if a transaction is started, okay, let's say the transaction is started, something happens, and everything falls through.
Yeah.
Does the person, the client, receives the funds back, or what happens then? Because there are some stipulations, there's different stuff within the contract, different stuff, and I think everybody's different. I don't know. What happens in that event?
Well, that's a loaded one because that actually stems from the beginning of the transaction.
Okay.
So at the beginning of the transaction, you would sign something called an agreement for sale. Before this agreement for sale is signed, both the vendor's attorney and the purchaser's attorney, they would go over it in draft and make sure that everything is in that document. The kind of things that are in that document or the clauses in that document really and truly determine what happens to the deposit if the sale falls through.
Okay.
Two things in particular are, the first thing is when there's an issue with the title. Now, keep in mind that this is, once the sales agreement is signed, the parties agree that the terms of this agreement are agreed by both parties.
Okay.
So once that is signed and you're carrying on with the transaction, that's when you would start all of your title search and you would go and you would get bank approval if you are going through a bank. And so one of the things is a defect in title. If the title is defective, the agreement for sale says that the person or the buyer would get their deposit back.
Okay.
If the other thing is obtaining financing. If the buyer has not obtained financing, that's one of the reasons they would get their deposit back. Now, I would say that underlying all of that, right, you have time limits.
Okay.
You have, let's say, from the date of the signing of the agreement, you have 45 days to obtain financing.
Okay.
If that 45 days is approaching and you've not obtained financing or you need more time, you would request the purchaser or buyer, I use them interchangeably, the buyer would request an extension from the vendor.
Okay.
The vendor would say, sure, give you a 21-day extension to obtain financing. Now, if that time runs out and you do not ask for an extension, the seller is going to say, your time has expired. Has the purchaser or has the buyer obtained financing as yet? And you have some attorneys that literally the next day after that 45 days up, you would forfeit your deposit.
Okay.
And so it's very good for attorneys to practice, keeping track of time limits on when you are to obtain financing, when this transaction would be fully completed, because those extensions, you would have to keep applying for those, especially with some banks, because sometimes they take so long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not only good for the attorney to know these time limits, but also the purchaser
Yeah.
to know the agreements and everything, to
Yeah.
ensure that they have everything written down, to know their time limits and everything in case
Yeah.
that an extension is needed.
Definitely.
Okay.
Definitely.
So if persons want to reach out to you to use your services, how can they reach out to you? They want to hire you to do some real estate transactions or different stuff for them. How can they reach out to you?
Well,
Okay.
they contact you at Colonial Realty and get any of their questions answered.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you again for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Our first interviewee.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm sure we're going to bring you back to ask you more questions about probably other transactions and different stuff within the
Yes.
real estate law. But thank you again for joining us on PKR episode 5.
Thank you for having me.
We'll see you again next week as I think it's going to be surprised. We're going to interview somebody else within the real estate industry and give you some more insight about the real estate transaction. So see you next week. Stay tuned. Talk soon.